In a 1987 documentary, this is what Rosa Parks had to say. I thought this was really appropriate. People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. Yeah. Nice. So this is my first time ever in Vermont, and the first speech I heard had a reference to edible chicken manure. And I'm pretty, well, I don't think my speech will be as cool as that. A lot of the other speakers here, Bruce, and what was the girl's name who was just on? Spoke of many of the same principles, so I feel like the job's already been done. But I wanted to share with you a couple of interesting history lessons that hopefully will be a good takeaway, not just on what the problems facing people today, but maybe an action plan on what you can do moving forward. So hi Carla. Back in December of 1850, a newspaper, the Memphis Daily Eagle, ran a really fascinating headline. It was titled, "The Administration and Nullifying Vermont." It reported, check this out, "The president and the entire cabinet are very much exasperated at the course of proceedings in the Vermont legislature. And at a long cabinet council held on the 7th, they determined to enforce the fugitive slave law in Vermont if it required the whole military force of the United States to do it." Anyone here familiar with the fugitive slave law? Yeah. Oh, all right, a few people, nice, okay. It's not history that you normally learn. This is what I consider maybe one of the most disgusting laws, I mean there are many, ever passed in American history. It basically claimed the power to compel every human being to be a slave catcher. Obviously it was focused on northern states in the 1850s. People were basically required to assist federal deputies and their marshals in catching suspected runaways. It brought all trials involving those runaways into federal jurisdiction, and they added large fines to people who may have helped. You know, think people like the Underground Railroad folks like Harriet Tubman and others. They were threatened with fines, really big fines for the time, for simply aiding a runaway, like by giving them food or shelter or water. It suspended habeas corpus, something that happens yet today, and a right to a jury trial for people who were alleged slaves. And it made their testimony inadmissible in court. But the person, so this is how it worked. You found a black man in Vermont, and there may have been a person who claimed that person was his property, who lived in Alabama. And if he claimed that this other person was his property, the federal law said that A, the state had to help catch this person, and then they would have this trial that person couldn't give any testimony. There was no habeas corpus, no jury trial, and the only person's testimony that was admissible in court was the guy claiming ownership of the other human being. And then on top of it, the judges, they were called commissioners, they were paid $10 for everybody who was sent back to slavery, and $5 if they were set free. So you've got this system in place, a black stain, obviously, one of the many on American history, where you had the federal government doing everything it could to continue the practice of slavery. But there were a lot of people who weren't too happy with that, and there was a growing abolitionist movement in the 1850s, before then as well, obviously. And a guy, I don't know, I think he's from Vermont, John Greenleaf Whittier, the famous poet, do people know who? Was he from Massachusetts? I always associated him with Vermont. Well, here's what he had to say about it. "Since the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law by Congress, I find myself in a position with respect to it, which I fear my fellow citizens generally are not prepared to justify. So far as that law is concerned, I am a nullifier." In response to that federal act, states all across the North passed what were known as personal liberty laws to frustrate the enforcement of the federal act. In Michigan, for example, they guaranteed any man or woman claimed as a fugitive slave all the benefits of the writ of habeas corpus and trial by jury. It forbid the use of state and local jails for holding runaways, and it made it a crime to send anyone free back into the South to slavery. A law in Massachusetts called for the removal of any state official who actually assisted in the return of runaway slaves. It disbarred attorneys who were involved in a runaway rendition. They used the term rendition back then, similar to what the Bush administration was very famous for. And another section of the Massachusetts law authorized impeachment for any state judges who accepted that commissioner position that would pay them the $10 for sending people back into slavery. But really what was the tip of the spear, the beginning of this movement around the North, was right here in Vermont on November 13, 1850. The Vermont legislature passed a bill known as what was called the habeas corpus law. It required the state to protect, and this is a quote, protect and defend any person in Vermont arrested or claimed as a fugitive slave. Woo! Yeah, nice. Now, some would say, okay, these politicians were passing these nice-sounding things. Maybe they were just grandstanding, trying to win some votes, get some corporate funding, or whatever it may be. But they were actually very effective in stopping the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. From my understanding, the U.S. military still has not fully invaded Vermont. I mean, I don't see any drones yet, but I guess they're on their way. But Millard Fillmore, the president, never invaded. And during the 10-year period of 1850 to 1860, there were only 4 cases throughout all of New England of anyone ever sent back into the South under this federal fugitive slave law. 4 times. The last one was in 1854 in Boston, a guy named Anthony Burns. So while it wasn't as effective as New England, other states around the North were also doing this. And they were so effective that when South Carolina seceded a number of years later, they issued what was called a Declaration of Causes, which explained why they were seceding from the Union. The first half was this long, rambling thing explaining their view of how the Union was created. And the second half, they listed their complaints. And the number one thing that South Carolina listed as a complaint was this, and I quote, "The states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa have enacted laws which either nullify the Fugitive Slave Acts or render useless any attempt to execute them." And it all started in Vermont. Yeah, nice. That was a cheap one. Now, South Carolina wasn't alone in thinking that this resistance, noncompliance, support of habeas corpus was really effective. When Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia seceded, they also listed this either right at the top or one of their top complaints as to why they were leaving the Union, the nullification of the federal fugitive slave law by states in the North. More on that in a minute. Fast forward to the 1920s. It's quite a bit of a jump, I'm sorry. But in case you didn't know, people throughout the 1920s drank alcohol. Ooh, I know, pretty nasty. Keep the alcohol on the patio. Now, what's significant about that statement, for those who already got it, is the fact that this was happening after an amendment to the United States Constitution known as the Prohibition Amendment. While it didn't ban the activity of an individual to consume alcohol, it created a mechanism to basically shut down the market, prevent people from buying, selling, creating, exporting, etc. alcohol. But yet, it still happened a lot. I mean, there's movies about it, HBO shows, things like that. We all know that people continue to drink in defiance of this so-called ban on it. In a 1925 address to Congress, this was what Senator Bruce from Maryland said, "National prohibition went into legal effect upward of 6 years ago, but it can be truly said that except to a highly qualified extent, it has never gone into practical effect at all." And if we want to know why, by that time, There were over 24 states throughout the country that had simply passed laws, or just stopped doing it, stopped funding alcohol prohibition enforcement. So because they weren't complying, they were saying no, maybe they were tired of giving in like Rosa, they weren't able to enforce this on a federal level, and they acknowledged that this was never enforced. And if we fast forward to today, there's another type of prohibition. Well, in many ways, there's all kinds of prohibitions. But in my home state of California, and I'd like to go on the record saying I think I'm probably the one who came the longest to be here. Anyone close? Nice, all right. I just happen to be in the neighborhood. In my home state of California, back in 1996, millions of people voted for something known as Proposition 215, which authorized the use for very limited medicinal purposes of a plant known as marijuana. Dangerous. Now, federal law doesn't allow this to happen. And obviously, people in California were smoking, buying, selling, growing, and producing weed before there was a law that allowed it to happen. But the fact of the matter is that when this proposition passed, and since then, it has had unbelievable effect, not only on the state of California, but the entire country, maybe even the world, some would say. Today, with Maryland, New Hampshire, and Vermont, Vermont's already in. Does Vermont have a medical marijuana program? Mini? So New Hampshire finally got the ball rolling, live free. But with Maryland, New Hampshire, and Illinois just this year, there are now 21 states around the country that are defying so-called federal laws saying that you can't have marijuana, you can't grow it, you can't sell it. Doesn't matter if you have glaucoma or some other disease that you need it for relief. The feds define relieving pain as a crime. But you know what? These 21 states, what they're doing is actually working. And I could go into all kinds of statistics. If you really want information on how it plays out, you'd want to check out, hi Jordan, a place called Americans for Safe Access, who does the best research on this. But a quick example, back in 2002, there were about 119,000 people registered as marijuana patients around the country. In the last 10, 11 years, George Bush was absolutely horrible, very aggressive on trying to shut down the marijuana programs around the country. Barack Obama has been even worse by leaps and bounds. Over that period, they've increased the amount of spending on marijuana enforcement programs 15 times the amount that they're spending. They've also increased the number of raids. Like in Southern California, in my town, there's about 1,000 of these businesses open just in one city alone, defying federal law. But they've increased the amount of raids also 15 times. But no matter what they do, the number of registered users and the number of businesses keeps growing, no pun intended. Oh, that one sunk in good. So in 2002, 119,000 registered users of marijuana. And in the face of all that enforcement by the federal government, there are now 21 states doing it and 1.1 million registered users of marijuana. And I just read a report from somewhere, it might have been in Huffington Post just a couple of days ago, that says 53% of the country now lives in states which don't agree that federal prohibition on marijuana matters. Doesn't matter that the federal government has a law on it, that the Supreme Court may have ruled against it. People are still living, so you've got over half the country that are successfully defying so-called federal laws. This type of resistance is very effective. From alcohol prohibition, which it totally stopped, to marijuana prohibition, which is getting ended as we see it. We're watching it happen today. It stopped the Fugitive Slave Act, and it can be used for any issue you can think of. And it's something that I personally call, and my organization, 10th Amendment Center, refers to as nullification. The way we define it is this: any act or set of acts which has as its end result a particular law being rendered null and void or just unenforceable within a particular area. This goes back to the principle that the previous speaker just mentioned. It's a very old principle. An unjust law is no law at all. Nice. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke on this very often. Immoral, unjust laws should not be obeyed. The founders that created the Declaration, the Constitution, they also held to this same principle. The idea was that an unconstitutional law was no law at all. So if they pass something that they're not authorized to do amongst those powers that have been delegated to them, it doesn't count. And the only way it will have any effect is if you sit idly by and allow it to happen. If you sit around and comply with it, then of course they're going to be able to do whatever they want. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, James Madison, who's known as the father of the Constitution, both put this to paper back in 1798 to talk about this in a response to a law known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. It was a set of laws that was, the short version of it, it basically made it a crime if you wanted to criticize the government. So Jefferson and Madison thought that was a total affront on your liberty. Freedom of speech is a big deal, obviously. And they wrote what were known as the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions of 1798 to put into principle the idea that an unconstitutional law is no law at all, and what you're supposed to do about it once you do it, once you have that happen. Jefferson had this to say, this is just a little bit, quote, "The several states composing the United States of America are not united on a principle of unlimited submission to their general government. And whensoever that general government assumes undelegated powers, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy." Now, Madison, on the other hand, in Virginia, so Jefferson wrote the Kentucky resolutions, Madison wrote the Virginia resolutions, the same principle. Madison said that when the federal government does things that are dangerous, unconstitutional, immoral, the states have a duty to interpose. He said they are duty bound to interpose. It's not just a good idea, but that's, I mean, why even have states if they're just going to sit around and follow whatever the federal government does? If they're going to do anything, they're supposed to try to protect your liberty. We know that doesn't really happen, but this is what the duty is for them to do. He said that they were supposed to do this to respond to deliberate, palpable, and dangerous acts from the federal government. In other words, according to those two dudes, the author of the Declaration and the father of the Constitution, when the government does bad stuff, you're not supposed to sit around and wait 2 or 4 years to vote some bums out in the hopes that the new bums will take away that law oppressing you and say, okay, citizen, you can now be free. And at the same time, you're also not supposed to wait 2 or 4 or 6 years for some court case in the hopes that some politically connected, unaccountable lawyer, wearing a black dress, mind you, will give you permission to be free. Oh, that law that they passed that you got arrested for, well, I know that caused you a lot of problems, maybe closed your business, but we'll take a do-over. No, you're not supposed to wait for those things to happen. You're supposed to stand up and resist, refuse to comply, and nullify as these things happen immediately. And looking around us, the wars, the drones, the spying, the printing, I mean, we could go into a long, long list here. I think every one of us should be in a position that Rosa Parks was in, that we're tired of giving in. So if you believe in liberty, if you believe in anything, really, the path is right in front of you. It's nullification. It doesn't matter if it's indefinite detention or prohibition, mandates, gun control, or the FDA. The method is the same. Until we refuse to comply with what are immoral, unjust, and just plain bad laws, they're going to continue getting away with what they've been doing all along. When Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus, she gave us all a lesson. It's very timeless on how to deal with laws that may be unconstitutional, immoral, or unjust, or all of the above. She didn't first comply and then decide, well, I'm going to go campaign for some candidate in the hopes that, well, you know, he's going to change the law and then I'll be able to sit where I want on the bus. She didn't first comply and then get involved in some expensive and unwinnable lawsuit, because most of them are. She did something that each and every one of us needs to do more and more in our own lives. I know I do. She sat there and said no. This is really nullification in action. Every single time a heroic pot smoker lights up a joint and violates federal laws, they are helping to render that particular federal act null and void or unenforceable. Every time a heroic war resistor refuses to deploy, they are doing the same. And in my neighborhood, every time I order from Authentic Thai Cuisine, who is operating out of their kitchen, without any permits, I'm sure, I'm helping them by giving them money to make sure. They're pretty awesome. One warning, though, this type of stuff is not easy. It takes courage. I mean, it's not easy to say, federal agency, you're oppressing me. It's much easier to kind of go along, live our lives, watch some TV, go shopping. I mean, Amazon is 2 days on everything. And in my area, I get groceries delivered to me in 6 hours. I mean, it's easy just to sit around and live our life. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Well, I mean, that's what you feel like you should do. Who doesn't want to just spend time with their family? But it takes courage, and it's going to take people who believe in liberty to be the tip of the spear, like Vermont, New Hampshire. Well, that's a bad habit. Like Vermont was back in 1850 with the habeas corpus law, resisting the federal slavery laws. So it's really easy to lose sight of what it's going to take, because this type of victory isn't going to come fast. So in closing, I want to share with you some of the most important advice I've ever read. It comes from the great libertarian author Murray Rothbard. He says, for the libertarian, the main task of the present epoch is to cast off his needless and debilitating pessimism, to set his sights on long-run victory, and to set about the road to its attainment. Our long-run victory isn't going to come by trying to take over the Republican Party. It's not going to come by trying to take over the Democrats or have a constitutional convention or find some guy to ride in on a white horse to save us in the executive branch. I want the government people to get the hell out of my life and yours. And the only way we're going to do that is if we nullify them into oblivion. Peace, Vermont. Thank you very much.
I'd like to say thank you all for coming out tonight, for joining us, for listening to great speakers, participating, all 9 yards. We couldn't have done it without you. We're going to do it again next year. Keep your ears open. So, next up, no introduction needed, Jordan Page.
This is my first time in Vermont. It's beautiful. I'm enjoying myself a lot. Hope you all have been too. I've been party to many interesting discussions over the last day and a half. So I wrote this song last year when our benevolent dictator passed the National Defense Authorization Act. It occurred to me that human beings were not learning from their history. So I wrote a song about history repeating itself. This is called The World Can't Wait. I know that the time has come for the whole world to see, but the world will not bear the burden we wear, or the truth that enslaves us and sets us all free. I know that the time has come for the whole world to see how truth takes a slave from cradle to grave and burns down the walls of his captivity. And the wheels set in motion on the road to ruin are spinning faster now. And the world can't wait forever in the shadow of a war. And the world can't wait, 'cause when we're dead and gone, it's all too late. Then it's all too late. I know that the world is blind with no way to see. The bond that was torn before we were born now turn the tides of war ultimately. And all consent is broken on the road to ruin, and there's no turning around. Oh, and the world can't wait forever in the shadow of a war. And the world can't wait, 'cause when we're dead and gone, it's all too late. Then it's all too late.
Hope you have enjoyed the presentations brought to you today by the Vermonters for Liberty from the Freedom and Unity Festival 2013 from Magic Mountain in Londonderry, Vermont. If you'd like to find out more information about Vermonters for Liberty, there's a place to go. You can visit their website, vermontersforliberty.org. That's vermontersforliberty.org. I'm Carl Parton, reminding you that every American citizen's greatest treasure is freedom. Vaya con Dios.
My daddy made this. Daddy!